Falik. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Citizen Year. We're a nonprofit social enterprise reimagining the pathway from high school to college.
My name is Jordan Lake. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and I just got back from Ecuador. I was living in the province called Napo, in the Amazon rainforest region of the country.
After I left high school, I was thirsting for more, and fortunately, stumbled upon Global Citizen.
The opportunity emerges if we can focus on one key question, and that question is this: what do our students really need to learn, and how do we reinvent the system around that? Each year, we recruit a diverse core of emerging leaders.
My name is Miley, and I'm from Carmel, California, in the Monterey Peninsula, and I went to Senegal. I'm going to UCLA for school.
My name is Kim Azenbeck. I live in Snohomish, Washington, and I'm planning to attend Wellesley College.
And we support them through a transformative global bridge year. They spend the year living with a family in a local community and working as apprentices.
One of the things that was really instrumental for me was the fact that Brazil was my classroom.
If I read statistics on poverty and inequality, that's one thing. Seeing it for myself, that's another thing.
And when they arrive on campus, they're not burnt out, but they're guided by a set of burning questions.
I want to go into chemical engineering or environmental technology. I feel like I can still do that and apply it in some way that can make a difference.
But this is really just the beginning. We're building a movement.
The way that I thought about things and the way that I have chosen how to live my life had completely changed.
I have a responsibility, and that we all do. We all can impact other people.
Looking back, there was so much space for me to grow as a leader and as a human being.
And the person that I am now is such a better man.
And so here's the question for all of you. Will you join us?
Thank you. Well, I enjoy showing that every time it was made by one of our alums, actually, who's now a student at the new school down the street, who's a videographer and actually on retainer for us as our ongoing social media and videographer, which is fabulous. What's our timing? What time is the class done?
9 p.m.
Yeah,
I will be in bed.
Yeah, long out by then. Okay, so we will find the right casing.
Yeah. I mean, it's really up to you.
Okay.
Because they'll ask you questions until 9 p.m. if we allow it. So.
All right. We don't need till 9. Fabulous. And is this? Okay, this is fine.
Yeah,
The slides and everything. I'm good.
Okay.
If you guys feel like you can see me. Perfect.
Ooh. Yeah. Oh yeah.
What happened? Thank you very much for having me. This is exciting. I've known Cheryl for many years, from a moment when this was a big idea with no idea how it was going to actually become a real thing. And she's been a source of inspiration and support since then in many ways. And I reference her in my mind even when she is not there, in ways that make me a little bit nervous now to be at the front of her class making up my information. So delighted to be here and admittedly a little nervous. So I think before starting, I actually would love to hear a little bit from you guys. I've seen the syllabus. I've heard about the genesis of this program from Cheryl for years. And I know that you all have an assignment, I think, for today that was about framing some guiding questions, which is something very parallel to something we do with the fellows in our program. But what I'd love to hear is just having seen the video and maybe the high-level gist of who we are and what we do, and I'll go into more detail. Would love to hear some questions that are on your mind. So these might be the questions that you came up with for the assignment, or the things that are coming to mind right now for you in terms of what you'd like to hear me talk about, because this could go in a lot of directions, especially since we have till 9 o'clock. I won't keep you very long. So yeah, feel free. Shannon, yeah.
Well, after I watched your video, I thought, oh my God, how do you come up with an idea and then actually make it a reality? And it would appear that that's what you're going to address.
Good, all right, we're well aligned. From idea to impact is number 2 there. So yeah, great. Idea to implementation. Lots to say about that. Other thoughts?
Don't be shy. If you got an idea how to grow an existing project to have more impact.
To have
More impact.
great. And I'm a huge believer that not everybody, in fact, very few people need to start their own things. And we talk about entrepreneurial leadership in our training, but it's less about sending everybody out to be an entrepreneur to start something new, and more about an approach to leadership that says, given my strengths and given the context and given the needs or opportunities, what is the best way to enact whatever vision it is? And I love the notion, Ashoka's really been a pioneer around this idea of intrapreneurship as well, which is working within an existing structure to innovate without necessarily reinventing a wheel by starting something from scratch. So happy to talk more to that as well. Yeah, please.
For my question, I wrote, what are the best ways to shift people's mental models? But when I thought about that, I was thinking more about people who are in power, and how you create that change. But with what you're doing, it's more about the younger people who are still, I guess, more malleable. So you might be.
Love that. Yeah, shifting mental models, and I can talk about that both from the perspective sort of at the unit level of the individual students in the program, but then more broadly, because what we're trying to do is actually shift the mental model in America, so that there is a new concept of how young people transition from one life stage to the next, that this idea of a bridge year or a launch year, as we like to call it, becomes the new norm. So I can talk to how we think about that and the levers we're pulling. Yeah.
What was the reason that you chose high school students just graduate going to college? Because you could choose different age group of the students too.
Great. So why this age group? I'll definitely talk about. Yeah.
I like how you talked about how we need to think of what our students really need to be learning and what we can do about that. So I'd love to hear more about what you've learned.
Great. We're learning about what kids need to be learning. Yeah.
Maybe you'll address this in your second point, but I'd love to know how the lessons you've learned along the way and how the model's kind of grown and developed from what it was initially to what it is now.
No changes. It's just what I first proposed to Cheryl. No, yes, there's a lot of evolution and iteration and trial and failure. So, yeah, happy to talk about that. Any more burning questions at this point? Yeah. What was that?
No.
Not a hand. Okay. Great. So with those, oh yeah, sorry, I didn't see the back.
How to make a living doing all of this
That's funny. I mean, I think there's a common misperception that sort of working for a not-for-profit means that there's no money involved or that you're not paying yourself. And I'll talk more about my sort of philosophy about not-for-profit work, and I don't even really like that term because I think all it says is what you're not what you are.
Other ways to make it a social enterprise that sort of creating value, that's social value, but not
Great. So beyond just making a living, how to maybe it's about a financial model that's sustainable and helpful to itself. Is that fair? Okay, good. Yeah, I'll definitely talk about that because it's been core to our story, and it will be as we grow. Good. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to keep these in mind. If any of these questions don't get answered, hold them, and at the end we'll definitely circle back and answer anything that is unanswered. And as you'll see, so what I want to do, is just introduce myself and my story, and where this idea came from, and then the process of translating a big idea into something that is actually quite real in the world still, to my surprise. Looking at where we've come in our first 5 years and where we're heading in the next 5, 10, and 20. And then I put together a couple of questions for you guys, so just given my understanding of what this course is about, some of the things that we're grappling with right now that we may not be able to answer answer this evening, but just to plant some seeds and to connect the work that you're doing here to the real world and sort of practical implications in growing a social enterprise. And then any questions that you guys have from there. If anything's really unclear, I don't love to just talk for a long time, so feel free to chime in with a question at any point if something's unclear or if it feels like it's the right timing to ask the question. So my own story, and I think we all have our own stories, and certainly any entrepreneur or social entrepreneur has either an experience or a series of experiences that helped illuminate an opportunity. And I like this notion of it not being really one experience that's the epiphany, but that instead it's a slow cook. It's this process of seeds that get planted and nurtured and iterated on over time. And Carrie, one of your classmates, was my classmate in college and just reminded me that my college thesis, now many years ago, was actually a blueprint for what's now become Global Citizen Year. And I think at some level I actually wouldn't have been surprised to know that that was true, but I knew also at the time that I wasn't ready to launch this in the form that I was going to be ready to launch 8 or 10 years later. And so, but what it helps me see is that there's a consistent through line, and not everybody has that. You have some through line. The dots always connect in hindsight, right? Standing as a college senior and graduating out into the world, and I had this thesis, but I had no idea how all these parts were actually going to make a story. So for me, it goes way back, and well, I'm going to come back and forth. There's not a clicker, I'm guessing, which is fine. I have to stand here. A little less antsy. I was very lucky to grow up in a family where my parents valued travel as part of our education. And they didn't have a lot of money at the time, but decided that they were going to take their 3 young kids with them all over the world. And we were in Southern Africa and Southeast Asia. And I remember vividly experiences, often with other young people about my age, and just having that sense of the world is huge. It is entirely random where and when I was born. There are kids just like me who probably have talents and aspirations regardless of where they happened to be born. And this idea that talent and the human potential is equally distributed around the world, but opportunity is not. And I'd imagine a lot of us have had some kind of aha like that. One of my mentors, who's the founder of City Year, which does something similar to what we do, but with placements in U.S. cities, talks about a social justice nerve. And the idea that once that nerve is exposed, you can't ignore it. I'm seeing a lot of, right? It's probably what brought a lot of you here to this work. And so for me, it happened very young. When I was in high school, I had an opportunity to live in a community in Nicaragua, which is where this photo was taken. And this, resource poor, but just an extraordinarily tight group of people, tight-knit family group of people. It was an opportunity for me to be immersed deeply in a culture that was very unfamiliar to me, and to participate in a very different rhythm of life. I was teaching in school, I was working in the fields, and I came back to high school feeling like, it's so funny that I'm going back to a classroom setting, because I feel like I learned so much more about myself and the world outside of the classroom. And so by the time I finished high school, I was antsy to do something bigger, and it's sort of an extended period of international work and observation and learning. So I called the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps said, little girl, go to college, we'll see you in 4 years, which they will continue to say. So you need a college degree today to join the Peace Corps, which is reasonable, and I understand why. There's an element of what Peace Corps does that is about young people in development-oriented roles internationally, with a controversial record of impact, I would say. But it struck me then, and it is still ironic to me today, that at age 18, your options, if you want to do something international, are to join the military, and 1 million young people sign up for military service as they finish high school every year. Or you could do some kind of religious mission.
and 80,000 young people will do a Mormon mission between the ages of 18 and 20.
It's funny because I grew up in Brazil, and I remember when I was a kid, I was seeing this American looking people that didn't really speak Portuguese and wore like this white shirt and this black bag.
Well, I'm fascinated by the Mormon mission because there's a reason that it continues, right? There's clearly a purpose that has to do with proselytizing, but there's something beyond that. And I think there's an insight about that age. There was a question about why high school. At age 18, you're transitioning from having grown up in a family unit, leaving home for the first time, and for an entire culture to embrace this idea that actually we should send you as far from home as possible to a foreign culture in a foreign language, and some of the rules that are set up basically forbid you from having contact in English with your home community. And you've got this huge daunting task ahead of you, whatever you think about the religious part. There's something there that they are invested in and have been for generations that I believe leads to what we see in sort of disproportionate representation in America of Mormons in leadership roles. You think about resilience and adaptability and a global perspective and language fluency. So I think there's something very potent there to learn from. And so taking those examples, it's this idea of how do we create a movement in this country and eventually around the world that's not rooted in service to your country, a la the military, or service to some god or religious purpose, but service to humanity. Really with a much more humanitarian type of mission, but tailored to this age group and this critical transition from one life stage to another. So fast forward, Peace Corps turns me down. I ended up going straight to college. And after 2 years of sitting in a classroom, I got really antsy and took off. I took a year off and was in Latin America. I went back to the same community in Nicaragua, and I had won a grant to work together with the community to set up their first library, which is what we see here with little Carlitos, my friend, reading the books that had been donated. And you have probably each had experiences like this and heard of experiences like this, and it sounds cliche at this point, but it was much, much, much less about anything I was actually able to do there and much more about how this experience impacted and influenced the rest of my life. As an aside, Carlos is now 22, just found me on Facebook, which is amazing to me, and is in medical school and says that he's still super inspired by having met me when he was young, just as somebody foreign who had had the courage to travel and to take the time to connect with him. So anyway, that aside, I came back to college and I had 1 year left. And I looked around and many of my peers had also taken a junior year to study abroad, which is the classic time in America that young people do this. And what felt so strange to me was suddenly I was in school on a mission. I had a purpose. I knew I was there. I had confidence to engage with professors. I had a learning plan. I knew what I wanted to study and what I wanted to get out of my classes. And I looked back on the first few years of my schooling in college and felt like what a missed opportunity. And I looked around and all my peers had had a similar experience. So it brought me back to that same question about why do we wait until later, and what an amazing benefit and opportunity if many, many more young people had that kind of formative experience before they arrived in school. And later when I went to graduate school, I was there with even more purpose because I'd been working for a while, and I think of each of you who had some real experience that has led you here with a set of questions you're trying to answer, and how different that is from the typical way that an 18-year-old arrives as a freshman on a college campus. So that's sort of the very early genesis. I can talk more about my own story, but I wanted to highlight what I think are some useful definitions of entrepreneurship. So the first, the pursuit of opportunity regardless of the resources under control. And that's the idea that starting something from scratch requires a huge leap of faith. So you see the opportunity and you have no idea where the funding, the people, or the partners are going to come from, but you pursue it doggedly because you know it's possible. And then the next, which I think goes very well with it, jumping off a cliff and knowing in your heart of hearts that you're going to be able to assemble the airplane before you land. Again,
And I just love this. I would imagine many of you have read Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In, which I find to be important and instructive. But I love this question of what would you do if you weren't afraid? And I ask myself this as often as I can remember, because the answer is usually different from what I'm actually doing. And so that's useful, and to me that relates to this sort of jumping off a cliff with an idea at an airplane to assemble. So there were questions here about how do you actually take an idea and make something of it. So just to fill in the gaps a little bit, I finished college with a thesis that was framing up global citizen year, but my instinct was that I wasn't ready to jump off the cliff. So I spent some time working in an entrepreneurial way, but in somebody else's safety net, to the question about not starting things from scratch. So I lived in New York for 5 years, and I worked for an organization called NetAid that no longer exists. And the no longer exists is a really important part of the story for me, because it was a not-for-profit, started with a ton of money and high-level visibility and public renown and celebrity endorsements and no clear plan for what it was trying to do in the world. And it was this curse of having more resources than we were actually even able to expend. But the real problem was there was no clarity around what we were all trying to do. And they brought together a really talented team, creative people, colleagues who I'm still friends with. But we kind of flailed for a few years. And in that context, I was able to assess where there was an opportunity. So broadly speaking, NetAid was about connecting people in the developed world through technology to supporting international development in other parts of the world. Now, it was launched in 2000. It was a joint venture between Cisco Systems and the UN Development Program. And in many ways, I look back and it was before its time. So it was trying to do what Kiva does today, or what global giving tries to do in connecting people. They just didn't even know how to use any of the technology yet. So I was able to spend my time there setting up a youth program. I was hired to sort of create the youth program for NetAid, and it wasn't even clear what NetAid did, so I had a lot of leeway. And what I came up with was really the predecessor to Global Citizen Year. It's called the Global Citizen Corps. And so we identified young people in high schools across America. We brought them together for a summer training in New York around issues of poverty and development. And we sent them back to their schools and communities to be peer leaders and educators. And we were getting some traction, and again, it was a great opportunity to be entrepreneurial but not have all the risk of it being my own organization yet. And I remember walking into the office of the woman who was running the organization. She was my boss at the time. And I said, great, Kim, here's my plan for how we're going to scale from 100 kids to every school in America. And she said, Abby, why don't you think smaller? And it was crushing to hear. But it was also this moment of, whoa, I am in the wrong place. And this is not where I'm going to actually be able to spread my wings and reach my potential and make big things happen. And so I remember so vividly to walk back to my computer, and the first thing I did, I'd had dinner the night before with a friend who was going to business school. I didn't know anybody who had ever been to business school. And I started Googling business school application deadlines and figured out that I had a couple of weeks left to still get something in, and by that fall I was in school. Why do I say all of this? It's sort of this period of experimentation. The work I was doing with Global Citizen Corps was really laying the groundwork for what I've continued to do in a different form. It was acknowledging what was an appropriate role for me to be playing at that point in time, and then using the experience of working for a broken organization to actually be a good student in that context. I love this notion that a good student can learn from a bad teacher. And that it was just taking responsibility for my own learning and recognizing that there was a skill set I was missing and I needed more training. And that training for me was going to come from a private sector way of thinking about building an enterprise. And for me, it was not about going out and starting a business in the classic sense, but I had a big idea for what I wanted to do, or at least the inkling of it. And I wanted to develop skills and frameworks and networks that were going to help me actually make it happen. So I spent 2 years at Harvard Business School, which was the last place in the world I would ever imagined myself. But it was a very, very important and formative training. And I went through school basically on a mission to create a plan to launch Global Citizen Year. And so I listened selectively in my classes, I read my case studies looking for the exhibits that I could then use in my business plan. I met with professors who could be advisors and eventually donors. I mean, it was just like super, super directed. And it was great. It was a great way to be in school. It was a great place to be on a mission. And I learned a lot along the way. So by the time I graduated, I had won the pitch competition, which for me was really a moment of clear commitment. I think up until then I had wondered, is this just me thinking this is a good idea and my mother encouraging me? But I remember making it was a 2-minute presentation to an auditorium of 1,000 people I didn't know. And among all these other ideas, this was the one that people voted to be sort of the most inspiring. And it was very encouraging. I got $3,000, which at the time felt really exciting, and basically moved me back to California to then move in with my parents for a while. As I got started, it didn't get me farther than that. So I've come up with a list of things that, as I look back on how an idea became real 5 years later, what are some of the steps, in case this is of interest or use? The first is this idea of becoming the expert, and this was advice that I got when it was still very much in a formative stage. And again, I was sitting with the City Year founder, Michael Brown, who's been really influential in my leadership. And I said, hey, I've got this idea. Are people familiar with City Year, by the way? Not so much. Okay, so it's a program in America that takes 18 to 25-year-olds to do 1 year of community service in an American city. And their vision is that someday this service year becomes common among young people, and they've been at it for 20 years, and it's the model for what the country has now established as AmeriCorps, which is like the Peace Corps internationally, but the placements are in the U.S. And so I went to Michael and I said, hey, I want to do kind of like what you guys do with City Year, but the placements will be international. And I actually asked the question, can I do it within City Year? And I asked that question because of my experience at NetAid, previous job, where it was an organization that shouldn't have existed on its own. And the end of that story is that they were acquired by a bigger NGO. And the program lives on at Mercy Corps, which is another international aid organization, which was the right kind of evolution of things. But it made me very sensitive to the idea that we just need to start new things from scratch if we have a new idea. And so I thought, maybe I should do this in somebody else's infrastructure, but we'll just do what they do, but the placements are international. He said, it's not what we do, but I'll cheer you on. You should go and do it. And he said, and by the way, I want you to come back 1 year from now and be the world's leading expert in what you're proposing. And I left and I felt like, what does that mean and how in the world do I do that? But I took it as my mandate, really, for the next year, which was my second year of 2 years of business school, to basically make a list of everybody in the world who should have some perspective on what I was trying to propose about international exchange for this age group, about the transition between high school and college, about the relationship between building a program and building movement that changes national culture. And I just went one by one, cold emailing people and saying, I've got this idea, can you spare half an hour to give me some advice? And I came out of that process with an advisory board of people like the head of the Peace Corps and the head of Teach for America who were champions for what we were trying to do. And truly feeling like I had developed some expertise in this very narrow slice of things, but that I knew when I then went out to convince people to work with us, to convince parents to send their kids, to encourage donors to join us, I knew that I knew more on this topic probably than anybody out there, and it gave me a sense of confidence that I know was part of how we were able to actually get started. It also gave me confidence about starting a new organization, because that was not where I started. I thought this might exist in somebody else's infrastructure. But the opportunity to really vet it and really have people ask you the hard questions. I mean, most of the meetings that year I would leave virtually in tears, feeling like I couldn't answer any of their questions yet. And yet, the reason it was so disorienting or unsettling was because I knew I needed to answer those questions. And so the next step was to chronicle those questions and figure out how I was going to answer. You know, why are you the right person to lead this organization? What's your theory of change? What are you going to measure? What's the impact, and how will you know that you actually achieved your goals over time? What types of kids are you selecting? What's the business model? So on and on. And you know, frankly, these next steps are really about those questions that came at me. So one piece is about mapping the landscape, which is part of becoming the expert, understanding who else does what else in this field. If it's a great idea, chances are someone else has either tried it and failed, or is already doing it somewhere. So figuring out who are the players, and if you're going to start something new, again, how is this distinct, and why does the world need a new thing rather than you joining something else? Defining the strategy, and I think the key piece here, and I've learned this from Kevin Starr, one of our first funders and a collaborator with Cheryl as well, but this idea that every plan needs two strategies in a sense, and they need to align. But if it's a social enterprise, you need an impact model, and you need a business model. And I think very often in the not-for-profit world, we've thought of the money part as a dirty word or an afterthought. But the reality is it's no different from starting a company in that you will have costs and you need revenues. And the challenge in a social enterprise is that those two things are not necessarily associated. So if you run a company and you're selling a product, you're selling to your customer. If you run a not-for-profit, you are serving a set of customers here, and then you are selling to somebody else. And so somebody has, recently suggested that running a nonprofit is really like running two businesses. You have your program business, which is the impact piece, and then you have your fundraising business, which is separate and not always related, except for when you can find ways to actually be earning income from some of the customers you work with, and I can talk more about how we can do that. Engaging allies, this is similar. Begin to raise money, and I can talk more about that if there are questions on this front. Lots of battle scars that continue to this afternoon. Sharing the vision and then inviting others to join. So you sort of have to go through those first steps, but then starting to build a team and mapping out what are your core strengths. One of the pieces of advice I got early on that was so helpful was this idea of spend a week and map your energy. So map the things you're doing in a week that give you energy and the things that take your energy. And your job as a leader is to build a team that allows you to spend as much of your time doing the things that feed your energy, which I think is really terrific. And what's amazing as you move through the world in that way and you look to build a team, you're looking for people who are energized by the opposite set of things, right? Like someone else gets energy from building a website, someone else from building a financial model in Excel. And for me, I had 8 fundraising meetings before landing here, and I am more energized than I could ever imagine, right? and I do it on 6 hours of sleep. It just doesn't really faze me because that feeds my energy, and that's the job. That's where we're really in our sweet spot. Pilot, evaluate, iterate, and I can talk more about this in the context of global citizen year specifically, but great advice again that I got early on was start small and contain. And I think this has become more of a mantra in the sort of lean startup era of things, but the smaller and more controlled your experiment, the quicker you can pivot or change directions or iterate or see if a small move or intervention actually changes the outcome. And then from there, it's mapping the path to scale, sort of keeping the big vision in mind and figuring out how to get from here to there, which in many ways we're sort of between stages 7 and 8 right now, and it'll probably be an ongoing iterative process there. I realize I haven't talked much about global citizenry or the connection to this, which I will do, but are there any burning questions before I move on? Yeah?
I have one question about the nonprofit and the culture of nonprofit, because I was in part of the nonprofit that started like way long, like 100 years or something like that. And then, the founding members are not there anymore, right? And then there's every 7 years they have a new CEO and so on. Then the expertise or their strategy or their agenda changes, but the organization name and what's supposed to do
it should stay, but I have to see that it doesn't continue. So like such an organization like yours, like when you imagine, like, have you ever thought about who to pass on when if you need to, and how to make sure that the purpose and vision of the organization continue to do so? Yeah. Is everybody hearing the question? Sort of about continuity. People talk about sort of founder syndrome or transition planning. I am still so energized by this vision and what's possible that I don't think about the day that I'm not actually leading this. But at the same time, I recognize that there's real value and potency to leadership staying fresh and organizations finding the right leader at the right moment in time. So my really honest answer is I don't think about that a lot right now. We're only 5 years old. But I do look out at peers and people I really know and respect, other social entrepreneurs who sometimes reach year 10 or 15 and are starting to step back and say, I'm going to take a role on the board of directors and find somebody else to be the CEO of the organization because I've given it what I can, and at this next stage it needs somebody else. So I can't speak from personal experience, but it's certainly an important thing to be thinking about. And a challenging one. And I'd imagine, again, sort of this point of you don't need to start something from scratch. Many of you may end up leading organizations that were founded years or decades ago by somebody who's no longer at the helm, and for incredible challenges and opportunities with that. You're not starting from scratch, you're building on somebody's vision.
I would just add,
Yeah.
because I think that's it's a challenge I come across a lot in the commercial world. Many companies are founded with a vision that doesn't, it's no longer connected to a person, the founder. But it feels like that's why it's so important for you to be able to communicate and bring people along to your vision, like number 6, sharing the vision so that it's not so much about Abby. Global Citizen Year has now a mission. It has a mission. It's an organism now with its own life, and in a healthy organism that gets passed on and it changes with the times and it changes with the leadership. But yeah, I think we see it all the time. Companies where the founder is such a strong presence or hasn't been able to translate their vision into the organism. And so I don't know, Apple. It's a great question and something to think about.
Well, no, and I appreciate that somebody once framed it as building a team, the difference between building a team of renters and a team of owners.
That's great.
And so I've been thinking about that ever since, which is how do I form a leadership team of people who feel deep ownership, because that's really what it's about. And so I guess my answer focused on me specifically, but one of my top priorities in the past couple of years has been building out a senior team of people. I mean, I've got to have a baby and a lot's going to change, and so my relationship to this organism is going to shift. And for the first time in our history, I feel confident that there are really capable hands that also feel ownership, and nothing's going to crash and burn. So that's very exciting. We'll see. I should not say that out loud. So I'm going to move on a bit here, and I framed this section as why we do what we do. And I think in social impact work, it's really easy to feel good about what you're doing, but it's really important to know the difference between feel good and real good. And the real good requires that you start with the end in mind, that you actually have a problem you're trying to solve and a way of measuring your progress solving it. So sorry to say I'm a little scrunched in the formatting, but so a couple of stats that sort of guide our work. One, which is not often cited, we talk a lot about the just state of terror in the American K-12 education system and what in the world we're going to do about it. We talk less about how broken our higher education system is, though I think it's getting more press.
and as it should. I don't know, people see David Brooks' op-ed yesterday about the changing role of the university, and that they're playing some function in sort of a commercial sense of preparing young people for the workplace, though arguably they're not doing as good a job of that, I think, as they should. But that they've completely lost sight of a broader, higher mission around preparing human beings with a conscience and a set of values and a sense of purpose. So, anyway, all that aside, the statistics show that America has the highest college dropout rate of any developed country in the world. So we're sending kids to college. 1/3 of college freshmen don't come back for a second year. And in a 6-year period, 50% will graduate. And for kids who are low income, first in their family to go to college, in a category that puts them at risk for not making it through, 8% will graduate in 6 years. Right? So there's something missing here. One of the other things that we're looking at is the fact that, in a world where 85% of the world's population lives in the developing world or emerging economies, less than 1% of Americans are ever going to meet about half the world's population that are still living in conditions of extreme poverty. 9% of Americans speak a second language. This is compared to about 60% of our peers in Europe. I would imagine for many of you in this room, English is your second language. And you're going to school in that language. Might be your third or fourth language, who knows. But, everyone else puts us totally to shame. And we've reached a point where it's really inappropriate that American schools are cutting foreign language. I mean, you can virtually not find an American high school graduate who, unless they grew up bilingual in their home, who's actually learned proficiency in a second language. This is a huge and missing piece of how we're preparing young people. And then this was a recent McKinsey report that 10% of business executives say our college graduates, so 10% say that college grads do have the skills needed for our global economy, right? All right, so 90% saying that they don't. And so when we step back and say, well, what's wrong with this picture and what's needed? What is needed for somebody to be successful in college, to be successful as a professional, to be a grounded and effective leader who can thrive in our fast-moving, globalized world? We actually know what some of those things are. And so I've just listed some of them here. And this is not just the soft stuff. There is actually data that shows that resourcefulness, often called grit, is the most important determinant of whether a young person will stick it out in college and actually make it through. Grit. So it's a set of non-cognitive characteristics, whereas K-12 education, focused on getting kids into college, is thinking about cramming your brain full of a bunch of statistics. But it's actually non-cognitive stuff that we know is most important. Optimism, integrity, empathy, cross-cultural fluency. And you may agree or not, but these are typically not taught in a classroom and not learned best by sort of sitting still and absorbing people talking at you like I'm doing right now. And I'm going backwards. So in the context of all of this, right, our higher education system is broken. And even for those who make it through, they are underprepared for what is most needed today. How can we change this system? And our proposal is by forming a new pathway into college. So the sort of requisite slide about mission and vision. Our mission is to unlock potential through a transformative global bridge here. Oh, just fun. Perfect. Sounded more severe than that. And the vision, which is sort of aspirational and a level above that, the 30,000-foot view, is a world in which this bridge here becomes the common expectation and the common opportunity. Language matters. I'd imagine this is something that you guys think about and talk about here. Something I've certainly spent time with Cheryl thinking about as well. But the traditional way of talking about this year before college is as a gap year, so some of you have heard of that concept. And we are adamant that we never use the word gap, except for when we're describing why it's not a gap. Right? So what it connotes is that you're sending kids into a hole and they may or may not climb out. And you cannot rally the country country around this idea that we're going to send every kid into a gap. So we call it a bridge year, or even better, starting to call it a launch year, because language matters. And then the other, you've heard me say this, sort of not nonprofit, not a particularly useful term. Call it, it's a social enterprise. It's for benefit, for social impact, for impact, are all ways that we can talk about the work that we do. Not for profit, I like to say, is our tax status and not our management style. So how does it work? What's Global Citizen Year about? You heard a little bit in the video, and this is just a visual that we put together that guides through the process. So students are in high school. They apply to us along the same timeline as they're applying to college. We have a pretty rigorous admissions process, and I can talk more about what we're looking for if that's of interest later. They spend the summer doing what we call the summer campaign, which is actually the first in a series of leadership challenges, where they have to tell their stories in their hometowns. We've got kids coming from every state across the country, and they have to raise $2,500. So it ends up being part of our revenue stream, which is great, but really, truly more importantly than that, it is their first opportunity to tell a story, to be resourceful and entrepreneurial, and to find people to take a bet on investing in them and their success. And it holds them accountable during the year. They're also asking those donors to sign on to follow their blogs and social media over the course of the year, so that this experience is not just about, Joe in Ecuador, but it's about what Joe can do to influence a whole community to see themselves in the world differently through how he shares stories during this experience. They come together for a training in the fall that we've just completed. We hosted it at Stanford, and it's a focus on personal growth and leadership with sessions in mindfulness, and authentic leadership and entrepreneurship. It's a piece around social innovation and social impact, and then a component that's about global competence and global context. But they all come together from across the country to have this shared experience before they then travel to their countries.
How many did you say?
So we've grown from 10 in our first year to 100 who just left a couple of weeks ago. So they arrive in their countries, and we currently have programs in Brazil, Ecuador, and Senegal. The first month is an orientation focused on language learning, cross-cultural abilities, understanding the broader context for what then happens, which is the heart of the experience, an apprenticeship and a homestay in a small community. So they live with a family, and they work on a local project. I can talk a little more about that. They then, after 8 months in their communities, come back for a re-entry program that's designed to catch them before they go straight home. Anybody who's traveled far from home knows that reverse culture shock can be sometimes more trying than the original culture shock. And then the last piece is they actually go back to their supporters and hometowns and high schools and make presentations that share their experience. It's closing this loop. It's being thankful for the experience they've had, and it's inspiring other young people to want to follow their lead. And then they move on to become part of our alumni cohort over time. This is sort of the deep immersion of living with a family. And some of the types of apprenticeships that our fellows do. So, often they're teaching in schools, they may be working in technology, in agriculture. Mariella on the bottom right here was working on a fuel-efficient cook stove project in Brazil.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Do they choose what track, or do they have someone student technology, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so it's a matching process. So they talk about what their skills and interests are, and we do our best to then find a good match with them. I should just pause here to say, these kids are young. I've already been a little bit critical of, Peace Corps as a development agency. And so what we're really focused on is how do we listen to what a community's needs are and find ways that our fellows can plug in to be helpful in some form. And so what we found through our first 5 years is there are a couple of core skills that they all have just by virtue of where they've grown up and how they all speak English. They're all techie, whether they realize it or not, but they've got a set of technological skills that can be really well deployed. And they're all young, which means they can be trained to be mentors and coaches and peer-to-peer advisors, which are typically the roles that we have.
And how do you go about finding the community?
Finding the community. So we have teams. Our team today is 25 people. Half sit in an office in the Bay Area where our headquarters is. The other half are in our 3 country sites, and they live and work there year-round. And most of our staff in country are from those communities. And the model is that each team of 10 fellows has a team leader who is responsible for plotting the homestays and the apprenticeship sites in advance of the fellows arriving. Yeah.
Sorry, do you have to pay as a high school student doing this?
So do you have to pay? So what's the business model? So this is for me, I think, an interesting evolution and part of the story. When I was first proposing this, the idea was nobody pays anything. Right? We're going to make it fully accessible, and I'm going to go out and raise hundreds of millions of dollars in philanthropy, right? And one of our first investors was a very savvy venture capitalist who was asking the questions he would ask of a startup company. And he said, well, wait, let me get this straight. You're going to give this away for free, but what if there are families who could help cover the cost, right? And so he pushed me to one extreme, and when I left, he said, come back and tell me you're going to fund the whole thing through tuition dollars. Which didn't quite feel right, because it actually meant that we were going to sacrifice part of the mission that was about making sure this was accessible to kids who might not otherwise have the opportunity. And so we found a middle ground, which is where we are right now. So it looks like a private school or a college admissions process, where we have tuition for the year and then a sliding scale based on financial need. And we raise philanthropy to support the scholarship fund to make sure it's accessible. And currently, and in past years, about 80% of our fellows receive some level of financial aid, and about a third receive a full scholarship.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you develop local relationships, and can you talk a little bit about that process of developing local relationships?
The local relationships. Yeah, so it's really in the hands of our team leaders and local staff who work in these communities from one year to the next, and the relationships they develop are incredibly valuable.
Are the families that host these kids, like, do they do that every year, or the families only do that at once, only at once?
It depends. We've had host families now for many years in a row. After a few years, we like to actually find new families to give the opportunity to. But one of our measures of success, and this is sort of one of the ways that I think that we are thinking and trying to act like more like a business than a sort of feel-good operation, is thinking about how are we measuring the impact that our fellows have in these communities. And there are all kinds of surveys that we've shared and ways of trying to assess this. But I'm really interested in sort of the simplifying questions. And for us, in this context, that question is this. We go to every family and every host organization, and we say, would you like another fellow next year? Would you refer another family to this program to have this experience? How likely are you to recommend this experience? And we ask those questions, and if the answer is yes, then you know that something is valuable, and something is valued by them, because it's not a financial relationship. So, yeah.
So if I lived in one of these countries and I opened my home to one of these students, that's an extra mouth to feed.
Yes.
So does the food, do I get some sort of
A stipend, exactly. So we compensate families for the cost of feeding and housing another student, so that this is not a hardship. But it's a sensitive calibration, because if you pay too much, it's a business endeavor, and you have to wonder why families are signing up. So in each context, it looks different, actually, that equation. So I mentioned that they each have blogs, and this is just a screenshot from our website. And can click on any of the fellows and sort of read their accounts from start to finish. And as we grow, building out training tracks around storytelling so that fellows can opt into writing, oral history, video, or photography, and really focus on those creative expression forms during the course of the year. And just some quick headlines, and I've shared some of this already, but since our first year, 2009, we now have 300 alums, more than 80% receiving some level of aid. Virtually all come back proficient to fluent in a new language because they're totally immersed, and there's rarely somebody in their community who speaks English. They all feel better prepared for college. And this is specific to kids who are on full scholarships, but it's important to us that they in particular feel like this was a terrific preparation for college. So what I cited earlier about 8% of low-income kids making it through college, we can actually figure out a mechanism that motivates young people to persist and complete. We think, adding a huge opportunity to how we think about diversifying the population of kids who are making it through college. And then I just love this one personally. So we asked, how many of you would want to come back and work for us someday? 97% wanted to come back and work for us, which is an indication that this was valuable. This is something that really was important to them and they want to give back to. So I've talked a lot about the program, and I want to just shift for a moment to how what we're doing is more than a program. And to be totally candid, if Global Citizen Year were to continue with 100 terrific kids each year, I would probably get a little bit antsy because I see that there's an opportunity that is so much bigger than that. So there's an opportunity both to grow the program, and we're envisioning, we have 100 kids now. Our 5-year plan would have 1,000 kids 5 years from now. Teach for America has 10,000 core members a year. There's no reason in my mind we can't be that size and force. But even so, 10,000 kids a year would be 0.001% of the high school graduates in this country, right? So are we actually scaling to the size of the problem we're trying to solve if all we're doing is running a program? And so we're thinking about other things we can do to not just be a program, but actually change the national norm, change a cultural expectation, change the pathway. So the first is about changing perceptions, which we do by working with the media and influencers and public figures, and it starts with this sort of transition from gap to bridge to launch. About changing practice, so we've started partnering formally with colleges, because the colleges benefit when they get an incoming cohort of kids who are better prepared to be good students on campus. Our most recent board member was the Dean of Freshmen at Stanford for 10 years. It was a new role they created for her. She was responsible for health and well-being among college freshmen. Now, Stanford has the most selective admissions rate in the country. They are getting enormously talented kids who have done very little other than get ready to get into Stanford, right? And they arrive and they're exhausted and they're burnt out, and their parents are typically sort of circling. So Julie, our board member, is writing a book right now about over-involved parenting and how it's stifling kids and preventing them from developing a clear sense of themselves. And she, Julie and I met, and she said, Abby, what you're proposing solves most of my problems. There's binge drinking or sexual assault or, lack of independence or lack of resilience among somebody who gets a B and doesn't know what to do with that. And so the idea that colleges benefit and at some point become our partners, if not our customers, and we're innovating with 2 models right now. One is a 1+4 year notion that we're launching with Tufts University, where kids get an admissions letter that says, congrats, if you want to take a bridge year, check here if you want to do it domestically through City Year, check here if you want to do it internationally through Global Citizen Year, and just easing that pathway and endorsing it as a university and providing the financial aid. Yeah, that's great, it's great. And just an aside, it's kind of remarkable to think about how this stuff happens, but a year and a half ago, I was having lunch, and I happened to be seated next to the provost at Tufts University, who happened to be working on a strategic plan for the college, and heard about what we were doing. He said, that's exactly the kind of thing we can get behind. And a year and a half later, it is a real funded program that is making huge waves across higher education. So you never know where these things go or how. The other model, which I actually think is even more innovative and radical, disruptive, is a 1+3 year model. So the new school is our partner in developing a curriculum so that kids can opt to take their Global Citizen Year as an academic year. They do reading and writing, they report into a faculty member, and at the end of the year they come out with a full year of academic credit. So they come back as sophomores. So what's exciting here is that this is not a 5th year of time and cost, this is part of college. So that's, I think, an exciting frontier for us.
Going off of that, how
Yeah.
much do the students have interacting with other fellows and with your staff while they're in?
Great question. So it's this team-based model. So a team of 10 are in one region, say in the Amazon and Ecuador. They have a team leader who's responsible for all 10 fellows. Team leader checks on you every week or so. You're typically on your own in your community. You might have a buddy if you prefer to be paired. And then every month the group comes together for ongoing trainings. But for the kids who are in the academic program, they're actually probably in weekly touch with a faculty member doing a distance learning program.
How many people apply to versus how many people you're actually sending?
When you apply versus sending, and this is going to be one of my design questions for you guys, because this is our biggest constraint to growth. So at any given point, you can sort of ask somebody what will either enable or constrain you from getting from where you are to where you want to be. And today it is finding enough great kids of the type we're looking for, who've got drive, curiosity, resilience, who are also willing to say, I'm going to do something that is against the grain, and their parents being willing to come along with them, because every pressure in this country is about go to college, don't pause. So with that as background, it's one of the things we're trying to figure out. We had last year 600 kids start the application. Some self-select out, we then select some out, and ended up with our core group.
And how do these kids get to learn about the program?
How do they find us?
Yes.
Through various channels, and I may hold there because that's going to be one of the discussion questions, if that's okay. So I'll just get through this list quickly. So, it's changing perceptions, changing practice, changing policy. So one of the ways to take any idea to scale is actually embedding it in federal policy. And so thinking about whether it's the Department of Education over time that could endorse this notion of a great year, or the Department of State, which is the department in America that sends kids abroad through Fulbright programs, or they actually spend hundreds of millions of dollars on international exchange every year, but virtually all of it is bringing international students to America, which is fabulous, but there is still a disconnect in recognizing that Americans need to travel as well, right? It's not just about teaching everybody about how we do things. So there's some opportunity for adjusting how that works as well. And then the final piece, and this is really our core program, we're changing the pipeline, right? So if we can select kids who are going to be movers and shakers and influencers over time, we are changing this pipeline of leaders who then, in turn, are changing the conversation. So the big vision, as I've shared, it's that this becomes the new norm. That, 5-10 years from now, it's a mainstream concept that kids take a bridge year. It's part of the admissions criteria at any university. Employers are looking at your resume and they're asking why you didn't take a year off between high school and college. And it just becomes part of who we are and what we do. So these were some of the questions I came up with, and it'll speak to this sort of how do we find kids, and I'm not expecting you guys to answer them, but just to show you that this is totally a work in progress. We've figured out like the first order questions, and these are some of the second order questions where I think design thinking and a sort of orientation around social innovation is really what is needed. So how do we find more great kids? How do we actually change a pathway? How do we build a business model that scales? And then how do we not just grow the program, but how do we scale the impact of what we're doing beyond the number of kids that we serve?